Good day. Today, in the morning, news came through that Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, has just been on a tour of the headquarters of the Russian forces who are fighting the conflict in Ukraine. And curiously enough, the Kremlin website, which has provided an account of the visit, is less informative on this occasion about the visit than the Russian news agency TASS. And Putin visited two different headquarters, and I'm going to read the TASS reports about his two visits. The first one reads as follows. Russian President Vladimir Putin visited the headquarters of the Dnieper battle group near the Kherson front. Whilst at the headquarters of the Dnieper battle group near the Kherson front, Vladimir Putin heard reports delivered by Airborne Troops Commander Colonel General Mikhail Teplinsky, Dnieper battle group Commander Colonel General Oleg Makarevich, and other field commanders. In opening the meeting, the president said, "I don't want to distract you from your direct responsibilities of managing the troops, so we'll be working here in a businesslike manner, brief but concrete. It is important for me to hear your opinions on how the situation is developing, to listen to you and exchange information. I would like to ask you to start your report with the situation at the Kherson front, then the Zaporozhye front, and then I will ask Mikhail Yurievich Teplitsky, that's the airborne commander, to give his thoughts." And Putin also said, "I know that on the orders of the Chief of the General Staff and the Defense Minister, General Teplinsky has been on the front line for quite a long time and has made a very thorough report. The Defense Ministry and the General Staff greatly appreciated it." And then this particular TASS report goes on to say that this is Putin's first visit to the Kherson region. Previously, he has visited Mariupol, and he's also spent time in Rostov-on-Don, where he held a meeting and heard reports from military commanders at the headquarters of the special military operation. So he's gone to one of the battlefronts, Kherson region, the area that covers both Kherson region and Zaporozhye. We're not told where the location of this place is, though it appears to be in Kherson region as opposed to Zaporozhye. We learn that the overall commander of the force there, which is referred to as the Dnieper battle group, is Colonel General Oleg Makarevich. And we also learn that Colonel General Teplitsky, who is the commander of the airborne forces, the paratroopers in other words, was also present at this meeting. He's been heavily involved in the fighting for a long time. He was, by the way, the primary commander, as I recall, organizing Russia's defenses west of the Dnieper River in Kherson region during the offensive, the Ukrainian offensive that took place there in the autumn. And though the Russians eventually took the decision to pull their forces back over the Dnieper River from the western bank to the eastern bank, where they remain to this day, nonetheless, Teplitsky, I think by general agreement, conducted the defense of Kherson region, of Kherson city, the Russian forces there, west of the Dnieper, through September and October with great skill. So he's obviously somebody who is highly regarded. He's prepared a detailed report, and this report has been well received, or so Putin tells us, by the Russian military leadership. Anyway, that was one visit, the visit to the forces in the south. And Putin has then also, we're told, visited the forces in the north. And this is Again, taken from the TASS dispatch. President Vladimir Putin visited National Guard headquarters east in Lugansk People's Republic, the Kremlin press office reported on Tuesday. There he received reports from Colonel General Alexander Lapin, other top officers on the situation on this direction, and this is Putin's first visit to the Lugansk People's Republic. The president congratulated the servicemen on the Easter holiday, as he had done during an earlier visit to the headquarters of the Dnieper battle group in Kherson region. The head of state presented them with a copy of an icon. Putin arrived at the Lugansk People's Republic by helicopter and drove to headquarters in an SUV. There he was met by Lapin. Putin greeted him with a handshake, then turned to the rest of the participants, greeted them and gestured to them to sit down at the table for a discussion. And then footage has been released which shows Putin, when leaving the headquarters, Putin and Lapin, surrounded by other officers, also had a conversation at their feet. Now, a number of things to take away from this. The first point to note is that Putin is visiting the positions, the headquarters, the Russian headquarters in the areas where Ukraine is most widely predicted to conduct its offensive. One is in the south, and the Dnieper group of forces, headed by General Mercouris, but also clearly advised and supported by General Teplinsky. Anyway, one is in the group of forces there, the Russian group of forces there, are the ones who are tasked with countering the much talked about Ukrainian offensive southwards towards Melitopol, assuming, of course, that is the Ukrainian plan, and that is indeed what the Ukrainians intend to do. So Putin went to this headquarters of the southern group. He heard their advice. He discussed with them what the situation was. He would have learned about their plans. Teplinsky has provided a detailed and exhaustive report about the situation. It's been, Putin tells us, well received. Putin heard it in full, and clearly it looks as if Putin went there, in part, obviously, to show that he took a personal interest in the fight in this part of Ukraine, and to demonstrate to the soldiers, to the officers, that he is fully engaged, but also, no doubt, in order to hear whatever concerns they have in advance of the Ukrainian offensive and whatever requests they might have for additional material and other support. And Putin did the same thing when he went north to Lugansk region. This is the other area where there are some concerns that the Ukrainians might launch an offensive in the Svatovo, Kremenaya area. The Russians have been hard at work over the last few months, strengthening their positions in this area, pushing the Ukrainians back, capturing forest areas and fortified positions, and of course building extensive fortifications. And Putin will have done the same thing when he visited this particular command, the command in the north, as he did when he visited the command in the south. He will have wanted to familiarize himself, firstly, with the operational plans of the local commanders, and also, at the same time, he will have wanted to hear whatever concerns and complaints they might have in order to try to sort things out when he gets back to Moscow. Now, note one rather interesting fact about the visit to the Northern Command, and that is the person that he met there, who is clearly the local commander. And it turns out that it is General Lapin. Now, way back in the early summer, when the fighting was going on in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, two generals played the key role in capturing the towns of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. One was General Surovikin, who is the commander of Russia's aerospace forces, and who, in my opinion, is the overall theatre commander in overall charge, and his headquarters is located in Rostov-on-Don. He is the overall commander. And Surovikin, by the way, we've been told by Prigozhin, was also the mastermind of the Bakhmut battle, that he agreed with Prigozhin that the Wagner group would start attacking Bakhmut, but would do it in such a way as to lure more and more Ukrainian troops into Bakhmut, the better to inflict heavy losses upon them. Anyway, Surovikin is the overall commander. The other officer who participated, regular Russian army officer, who participated in the fighting to capture Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, was General Lapin. And General Lapin remained a fairly senior commander until an incident which took place, for the best of my recollection, in October, when the Russians took the decision to pull their troops out of Krasny Liman, which then became Liman again, at least in my videos. The Ukrainians, of course, always called it Liman. This, of course, being in effect the final battle at the end of Ukraine's Kharkiv offensive. After that, Ukraine's Kharkiv offensive basically came to a stop. Anyway, the retreat from Liman caused a great deal of anguish on the part of various people in Russia. There were lots of angry commentaries about this. Many people were very dismayed at the loss of Liman. And General Lapin, who had actually deployed regular Russian troops to Liman, basically to evacuate the garrison that was located there. Lapin came in for much criticism. He was loudly criticized by Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of the Chechen government, who's an important player in the war and has played a large role in getting forces assembled to fight on the Russian side, Chechen forces to fight on the Russian side. And Prigozhin also supported this criticism. And there was some debate and discussion, and General Lapin was then recalled to Moscow. Then we heard a few months after that Lapin had received a position in Moscow, a senior position in the Russian Ministry of Defense. As far as I'm aware, he still holds it. But clearly, he has been reassigned to take up his post as the area commander in the north. And I have to say that at the time when Lapin came in for all that criticism from Kadyrov and Prigozhin, I was reading a significant amount of commentaries, including from Riba, which is the one of the most interesting and effective collectives of reporters who provide updates on the conduct of the war from the Russian side. Anyway, a lot of them actually said that Lapin was actually an extremely capable and courageous officer. He was being blamed for what had happened in Liman quite improperly, that in fact he had not been responsible for the defense of Liman at all, or for the decisions to strip Kharkiv of troops, and that in fact his only part in the fighting there was, on the contrary, the positive one of rescuing the garrison of Liman, numbering about 500 men, by the way, which had been at very real risk of complete encirclement by the much more numerous Ukrainian forces. So clearly someone in Moscow agrees, because Lapin has been reappointed to a senior position in the Russian forces, and he's taken overall charge of the situation in the north. Now, I'm assuming there's been a great deal of discussion and debate about conflicts within the Russian leadership, and including the Russian military leadership, and there have been arguments, as we know, between Prigozhin and the Russian general staff. I get the impression that somebody's been working very hard to smooth all the ruffled feathers down. Prigozhin seems to be working again successfully with the Russian military in their assault on Bakhmut. I'll come to that in a moment. So that seems to have sorted itself out, and I suspect the same thing has happened over Lapin's reappointment. Somebody has been working very hard to try to bring everybody together, to get them to work together as part of one team. And I'm going to guess that that person is primarily Putin himself, that he regularly talks to Kadyrov, for example, with whom he has an excellent relationship. He's always got on well with his senior military chiefs. And I think that Putin, who is a skilled diplomat, as we all know, has probably exerted himself to try to get all of these various parts of the Russian military system working together. And I would not be surprised if one reason for Putin's visit, probably there've been multiple reasons, but one of them was again for him to show his personal endorsement of Lapin. Anyway, there we go. So we now know that General Mercouris and General Lapin are the two key commanders in the south and the north. This is the areas, by the way, where the Russians have built up these enormous fortified lines that we've been hearing so much about. We also learned that the airborne forces commander has also been heavily involved in providing overall information. He had extensive experience of leading the defense in Kherson region in the autumn. This is General Templinsky, and he's provided a detailed report on what needs to be done to repel the Ukrainian offensive when it comes. Now, I'm going to return to the Ukrainian offensive shortly, but in the meantime, I will simply say that we've had more news from Bakhmut, and that seems to be where most of the fighting is taking place at the moment. There's been suggestions that the fighting in the north, in the Svatovo-Kremenaya area, is every bit as intense as the fighting in Bakhmut, and that Ukraine's losses there in manpower are on the same scale as in Bakhmut. Well, there just isn't the degree of information about what's going on the northern front that there is about Bakhmut. And about Bakhmut, well, lots of reporters, lots of information, but we can state a few things. Firstly, the major push that's being made by the Russians is clearly in the northern part of Bakhmut. And they seem to be taking 2 city blocks a day. And they're edging closer that way to pushing towards cutting the road, the so-called road of life, the road that leads through Chromovo, and which comes from Chasov Yar, and which has been the one road that Ukraine has continued to try to use in order to keep some reinforcement going of its forces in Bakhmut. The southern spur of the same road through Ivanivska, I suspect, is largely unusable, is completely unusable. Anyway, there are 6 blocks apparently away from this road, or so I've seen, so it's been suggested, but they're edging ever closer. And I will say this, if the road is indeed cut, then it's over. I can't see how a battle can be sustained if the communications are completely severed. But though that is interesting in itself, that the Russians are pushing northward 2 blocks at a time towards this particular road, and where the road enters Bakhmut, presumably. There's been another development which is arguably even more interesting, and that is that the Russian Air Force has now been conducting extremely heavy airstrikes around Bakhmut. Now, a couple of days ago, I was talking about reports that the Russian Defense Ministry was publishing, in which they talked then about the fact that the Russian Air Force was conducting sorties around Bakhmut. I'd assumed that these were largely sorties by light ground attack aircraft, the Sukhoi 25. In other words, it now is clear that much more powerful supersonic fighter bombers, Sukhoi 35s and 34s and 30s, are in fact participating in this air campaign around Bakhmut, and that they're dropping big precision-guided bombs. And in fact, yesterday, we got reports that up to 10 bombs, 10 of these huge bombs, 500 kilos, were dropped on Ukrainian positions. And some of these appear to have been dropped on Ukrainian positions in Bakhmut itself. The Ukrainian Ground Forces commander, General Syrskyi, has actually complained about this. And this is from Reuters now. He says that they report Syrskyi as saying in a statement issued today, currently the enemy is increasing the activity of heavy artillery and the number of airstrikes, turning the city, he means Bakhmut, into ruins. And the Reuters goes on to say, Bakhmut's capture could provide a stepping stone for Russia to advance on 2 bigger cities it has long coveted in the Donetsk region, Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. So there we go. So heavy Russian bombing of Ukrainian positions in Bakhmut. Now, this is clearly a rain of fire that is now taking place on the small area in Bakhmut still under Ukrainian control. And of course, the Ukrainians have built fortified positions, as I've discussed many times, in these apartment buildings that exist in all of these cities to a certain extent. And of course, they will have built other fortifications, other fortified posts as well. The point of using these heavy bombs, 500 kilo bombs, is that they are intended clearly to break these fortifications. In other words, to accelerate the capture of Bakhmut. And it's also been suggested that the Russians are now bombing that road and the supply routes into Bakhmut, making it even more difficult for the Ukrainians to deploy their troops there. So that, by the way, reminds me a lot of what happened during the siege of Aleppo in Syria back in 2017, that the Russians were able to carry out heavy bomb strikes near Aleppo, attacking the Islamist insurgents who were trying to break into that Syrian-controlled city, or at least part of which was under Syrian control. Part of it was, in fact, under insurgent control. But anyway, the key point about the Russian airstrikes, as I remember, was that, yes, they did attack fortified positions held by the insurgents within Aleppo itself from time to time, but the bulk of the airstrikes was targeting the supply and logistics centres leading into Aleppo. And the Russians had a very detailed understanding of where all the various logistics centres were. And over weeks and months of a prolonged air campaign in Syria, the situation eventually evolved to the point where the insurgents basically ran out of supplies. They couldn't keep their supplies coming to the front lines, and that exhausted them, and that made them intensely vulnerable to Syrian army attacks, the Syrian army's offensives. And I'm going to suggest that we're going to start to see something of the same tactic being used in Ukraine by the Russians. Until this point, the Russians have not been able to conduct that sort of aerial campaign in Ukraine because of the efficiency, the capability of Ukraine's legacy era Soviet air defense system. But it's clear now that it has become depleted. It's not entirely disappeared, and it's getting some support from the West. But as Brian Beletic pointed out in a recent video, the fact that the United States is now having to actually place orders with manufacturers of NASAMS, surface-to-air missiles, suggests that the United States is finding it difficult to keep Ukraine supplied with air defense missiles for that particular system, the NASAMS. And though the Patriot is going to be deployed in Ukraine before long, brought into operational use, presumably in conjunction with Ukraine's offensive. As is well known, missiles for the Patriot system are in short supply, and the French Aspide system is not going to be supplied until July, and frankly, it's not up to it's only going to be one battery apparently, and there aren't that many missiles made for it in any event, and it's going to be very difficult, or so it seems, for the French to be able to supply air defences to Ukraine in any great quantity. So, steadily, the Russians are now deploying their air force more aggressively, and as I said, I suspect that this will not be an American-style shock and awe campaign. It won't be a campaign to try to attack Ukrainian political leaders, for example, decapitation strikes and all of that. What the Russians will focus on is ammunition dumps, logistics centres, that sort of thing, in order to starve the frontline troops of supplies. Anyway, in the meantime, as I said, these heavy bombs are falling on Bakhmut, and we'll see what difference they make. I mean, they are pretty devastating. There was a picture that was circulating of a huge cloud, mushroom cloud, over Bakhmut. Presumably, one of these bombs hit an ammunition or fuel dump, and that presumably explains the size of the explosion. So we will see what happens and whether the Russians continue to drop more of these bombs on Bakhmut as well as other places. I understand, by the way, that these bombs are relatively cheap and the Russians can produce them in very large quantities, and apparently they are stepping up production of these bombs all the time. Now, these are 500 kilo bombs, and I just wanted to explain a few things that I've now been informed about. I'm not personal with any kind of expertise on bombs, but I'm told that the principal bombs, the types of bombs that Russian aircraft typically fly with, bombs that have been contoured to be capable of flying on fast-flying aircraft. They were designed apparently as far back as 1962, and they come essentially in two sizes, 250 kilos and 500 kilos. And these are the most widely used bombs carried by Russian aircraft. And it's clear that 500 kilo bombs are the ones that are being principally used at the moment as glide bombs in this campaign. There does seem to be a relatively new, there is a 1,500 kilo glide bomb, 3 times bigger than the 500 kilo bomb. And I presume that this is a relatively new development, because this is also carried, as I said, by the Sukhoi 35s, 34s and 30s that are carrying these, more typically, these 500 kilo bombs. And by the way, there's a film also circulating of a simply enormous bomb crater. You can see men walking inside it in sort of shock after given its enormous size, and they look very small relative to the size of this enormous crater. And I wonder whether that might have been the result of an airstrike by one of these big 1,500 kilo bombs. Though I would say I'm not obviously an expert on bomb craters, so I'm not going to say. But anyway, it seems likely that the precision guided bombs the Russian Air Force will be using in its aerial campaign will be of 500 and 1,500 kilos. These will be the two sizes of bombs that are going to be used. Now, when Shoigu visited that factory, he appeared, there were pictures there of him with much bigger bombs, 3,000 kilos and 9,000 kilos. These are enormous bombs. It seems that these bombs will probably be dropped by Russian bombers, by heavy bombers, the Tupolev 22 M3s. And these will almost certainly be unguided, or at least if they are guided, they will most likely not be glide bombs. They won't operate as glide bombs. But they could be used against bunkers and heavily fortified positions. And of course, they could also be used to destroy the Dnieper bridges, if that's the plan. But anyway, I just wanted to explain that. Apparently, these big bombs are actually of an older design. They go back to 1954. They're not, as I said, from 1954, but that is when they were designed. And as I said, they're now going to be used presumably as gravity bombs, as the Russian offensive gathers pace. So that just wanted to say all of that about these Russian bombs. Now, all of this is quite interesting about guided and precision-guided bombs, because, of course, it was the United States that started using precision-guided bombs in a big way during the last years of the Vietnam War, and then which used them to seemingly spectacular effect in the 1991 war with Iraq over Kuwait, and which of course has used them extensively ever since. Other countries also have guided bombs. Britain does. By the way, for the record, the heaviest British bomb, operating bomb, is apparently around 230 kilos. So it is much lighter, smaller bomb than any of the Russian bombs. But anyway, just saying this. But the US, as I said, has had a long history of using guided bombs, and they have supplied guided bombs to Ukraine, JDAM's bombs. Except they haven't apparently been working very well. And there's been some debate in the United States as to why that is. And this was touched on apparently in one of the reports that appeared in the Pentagon Papers 2 document leak. And there's also been an article about it in Politico, which has done some further investigating on this topic. And it seems that there were two explanations why these bombs have disappointed. The first is that there were problems with the fusing. The Ukrainian technicians weren't, fusing these bombs properly. And that problem apparently has been resolved. But the second problem is much more interesting and much more serious, which is that these bombs, these JDAM's bombs, principally use GPS guidance. And Russian jammers are now increasingly succeeding in jamming GPS signals used by these bombs. And not just by these bombs, by the way, but also apparently by Excalibur shells launched by the M777 howitzers and other 155mm artillery pieces supplied to Ukraine by the US, and also, importantly, HIMARS rockets. They also use GPS guidance. And it seems that the Russians are gradually becoming more successful in jamming the GPS signals that guide these particular munitions. The JDAM's bombs, the Excalibur shells, and the HIMARS rockets. And apparently only about around 5 out of 9 JDAM's bombs have been hitting their targets, which is disappointing. Apparently, one would expect precision-guided bombs to do better than that. And one gets the sense that with Russian jamming becoming increasingly more effective as the Russians get to understand these systems that they're up against better, that the capability, the ability of the US to counter this jamming will gradually diminish, and the effectiveness of these particular munitions will fall. Now, notice that this is something that was brought up at the time when the HIMARS system was first delivered to Ukraine. I can remember at the time, and I actually mentioned it at a video at the time, that with the HIMARS system using GPS, in order to achieve the precision effect, that this was potentially susceptible to jamming. Anyway, I also remember that very soon afterwards there was a whole host of places where we were told that this was simply not possible, that it was impossible for the Russians to jam GPS signals in that sort of way, and that the sheer number, the uncertainty as to when these HIMARS rockets would be fired would make it very difficult for the Russians to focus, their jamming on the particular rocket system, and though there might be a theoretical possibility of conducting jamming, it simply wasn't really an option. Except, apparently, that it is in fact now happening. The Russians are finding ways, presumably to detect the launch of HIMARS missiles and the launch of Excalibur shells, and to track the launch from Ukrainian aircraft of JDAM's bombs. And they're able to switch on their jammers, which are becoming more advanced all the time, and they are succeeding in jamming these systems. Now, note that the United States does not seem to have any comparable jammers it can supply to Ukraine, which would affect the Russian precision-guided bombs, which, by the way, don't get GPS signals. They get signals from Russia's equivalent of the GPS system, which is the GLONASS satellite array system. So, anyway, I'm just saying. Now, given the steadily growing electronic warfare capabilities that the Russians are showing in this war, given that just about a week ago, The Guardian was also talking about the fact that Ukraine was struggling to continue to operate its drone fleet effectively because Russian jamming was causing Ukrainian operators increasing problems in controlling their drones, and increasingly their drones were escaping their control. I'm going to suggest that this is another reason why there is this hurry to get this offensive, this Ukrainian offensive, going as quickly as possible. Because by the autumn, it's not inconceivable that Russian jamming technology will have advanced to the level where these various munitions, the Excalibur shell, the HIMARS rocket, the JDAM's bomb, have significantly reduced capability. The window, as even Lloyd Austin admitted way back in January, the window is closing. The window for a successful campaign, for a Ukraine achieving any kind of success, is closing. And we see this in all kinds of ways, and I would suggest that this electronic warfare thing is just one further example. Anyway, on the topic of the spring offensive, I'm just going to make one brief observation, which is that a lot of people have talked about the fact that one of the documents that's been leaked in the Pentagon Papers dump apparently gives a date, 30th of April, for when the offensive is supposed to be launched. Well, that could be the date. It could also be misinformation, but I suspect that that particular document is a bit old now, and if it is indeed the case that the offensive has had to be postponed by a month, then that might suggest that we're looking at June rather than May. Now, I'm not going to put any weight on that. I don't think anybody should. For all I know, the offensive could start today or tomorrow. But as I said, I don't think anybody should put too much weight on this 30th of April date. I know for a fact, the Russians have said for a fact that they are not. But anyway, Putin is going to the battlefronts. He's speaking to the commanders. They've built up all these fortified lines. They are prepared to repel this offensive. And the big question for me, by the way, which nobody, as far as I know, has addressed, is this actually going to be a bigger offensive than the offensive Ukraine launched in the autumn, the Kharkiv and Kherson offensives? Because I remember that the mood music in the lead up to the Kharkiv and Kherson offensives in the West was far more positive. There were far more optimistic expectations about the prospects. I seem to remember that the Ukrainian forces that had been assembled for that offensive still came from the original Ukrainian army. There'd been some kind of decision by Ukraine to hold back some of its forces in reserve and then to deploy them, as I said, in the Kherson and Kharkiv offensives in the summer, once the Russian offensive in Donetsk had lost momentum. And I wonder, and I can also seem to remember that the numbers of troops involved in these offensives, these two offensives, was in aggregate about the same as the number of troops we're hearing talked about in the offensive that is coming. In which case, it seems to me that this may be actually a less powerful offensive than the offensive in the autumn. The Ukrainian army of the autumn had more experienced commanders and officers and soldiers than the Ukrainian army today does. It had trained. It was still operating systems, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, such things with which it was familiar with, as opposed to this hodgepodge of Western weapons it's now been supplied with instead. And as I said, the numbers seem to me to be about the same. Anyway, I just wanted to throw in that because I'm not certain about how big this offensive is going to be. Anyway, the G7 has had a meeting in Japan where they've reaffirmed their commitment to Ukraine, as they were bound to do. There is, however, growing evidence of disquiet, and it's coming, interestingly enough, from Eastern Europe, and a whole cluster of East European states are now banning imports of Ukrainian grain, bringing upon them the wrath of the European Commission. And the Russians, for their part, have basically pulled out of the grain deal with Ukraine and Turkey, the one that was negotiated all the way back in the summer. They've always been angry that their part of the deal, the part that the EU had of facilitating exports of Russian grain and fertilizer, that was held up in European ports. The Europeans gave repeated promises that this would happen. The Russians have repeatedly complained that it has never happened. And it looks as if the original grain deal, brokered by the UN and Turkey, agreed by Russia and Ukraine back in the summer, that's basically run its course. So we see problems there. Grain being a major export for Ukraine. One does wonder what effect that's going to have on Ukraine's economy. One also has to wonder what the effect of all these blockades and counter-blockades are going to have on global food prices. Whether we are going to see another spike in food prices over the next few months as a result of interruptions from the war. And there's increasing complaints from countries across the global south that even as the West remains fixated by the war in Ukraine, they're showing less and less interest in the economic spillovers which are affecting the global south. Specifically, the global south is now under severe pressure. Many countries in the global south are under severe pressure because of the tightening of monetary policies in the United States and Europe, the increases in interest rates, and many of these countries are heavily in debt. Many of the businesses in these countries are heavily in debt. Much of that debt is in Western currencies. And they're complaining that the economic war the West has waged against Russia is failing to break Russia, but is putting extreme pressure upon them. And I think this is true. And I think this is another factor that is causing the global south to become increasingly exasperated with the stance of the Western powers. I would say, by the way, that the response of the Western powers to this rise in financial pressure on the nations of the global south, predictably, is to blame China. Supposedly, Chinese debt is the problem, even though Chinese debt is only a fraction of what Western debt is. And I would add that one of the demands that the Western powers appear to be making is that China should agree to cancel much or most of this debt, or at least to restructure this debt. Well, maybe the Chinese should do that. But the Chinese are saying, well, if that's what is expected of us, then the West should do the same. And in particular, there should be restructuring of debt owed to the IMF and to the World Bank. And of course, the Western powers are saying, no conceivable way we could even conceive of doing such a thing. It's just the Chinese, apparently, who must restructure their debt. And obviously and unsurprisingly, this isn't going down very well with many people around the world. It looks as if, as I said, as far as I can see, the West is simply trying to shuffle the blame for the increasing problems many global south countries are having. It's shuffling them on to China. Anyway, we'll see how all that spills over, what in the end becomes of all of that. But in the meantime, I have to say that the geopolitical, the global international environment, things are not looking for the West at all good. There's an article in the Financial Times by Gideon Rachman in which he acknowledged the extent to which the Western powers have failed in their attempts to rally global opinion against China and Russia. And he says that for the Western powers, the war in Ukraine is a straightforward territorial land grab by the Russians, completely different supposedly from all the multiple wars the West fights. For the global south, however, well, they don't take that argument at all seriously. They see it instead as a geopolitical conflict in which the West is very much a party itself and plays a large part, carries a large part of the blame, and where and in which the interests of the global south are being ignored. And we're starting to see an increasingly tetchy and angry exchanges between Western governments and some global south countries. And there's now been a particular row emerging between the United States and Brazil. And it's clear that the US was extremely annoyed that President Lula of Brazil has turned out to be actually less accommodating to US policy than many people in the United States in Washington had assumed he would be. Why they thought that Lula, as I said, one of the founding members of the BRICS, somebody who has a long history of political struggle in Brazil against, let's say it straightforwardly, Western-backed, US-backed right-wing governments there, why they assumed that Lula, of all people, would be on side with them, both over China and over Russia and Ukraine, I have absolutely no idea. But anyway, the long and the short of it is that they are. And we've now had apparently some rather angry comments about Brazil parroting Russian positions on Ukraine from, I understand, John Kirby, the Pentagon spokesman. And I gather there's been other, even harsher things said behind the scenes. And Lula, for his part, is said to be increasingly frustrated. He's becoming increasingly exasperated by this Western position. And he's now trying, to the best extent that he can, to put together, it seems, within the G20, a peace group, a group of countries that advocate for peace, in counter, in effect, to the G7. Now, whether that will happen, I don't know. And I would add that President Lula's position in Brazil is far from solid. He gained power in a very narrowly fought election. His victory was then disputed. He might not be able to consolidate his position in Brazil. It's still very early days, and he's said to be encountering problems in re-establishing his authority. His party, for example, does not have a majority, as I understand it, in the Brazilian Congress, and Lula's government is having difficulties persuading the Brazilian central bank to loosen monetary policy, which is something that the Brazilian government wants to see. So, it may be that this quarrel between Lula and the US is not going to go well for Lula. But all I am saying is, the very fact that this kind of quarrel is taking place at all, again, shows how completely the West has misread this conflict. They assumed a rapid Russian economic collapse after the sanctions from hell were introduced. For the record, Russian foreign currency and gold reserves are now again valued at above $600 billion. They were $630 billion at the time the sanctions were imposed. So they're only $30 billion down from that figure, at least if you believe what the central bank and the finance ministry in Moscow are saying, which I do, by the way. So the Russian economy was not crushed. It's looking like achieving any kind of military results in Ukraine beneficial to the West is going to prove very difficult. Their arsenals of weapon systems are becoming depleted. Eastern European states are now stopping imports of Ukrainian grain. And the relationship between China and Russia gets ever closer. Li Shangfu, the Chinese defense minister, by the way, I believe is still in Moscow. There's been some comment about the fact that when Putin visited these headquarters, Gerasimov and Shoigu, the chief of staff and the defense minister, weren't with him. The Kremlin says this is a precaution. I think the major reason is that they're still having meetings in Moscow with the Chinese. But anyway, that's for another day. Anyway, that relationship is getting closer, and the West is finding itself experiencing tensions in its relations with the global South. Time for a change of course? Maybe. We'll see. Voices to do this are indeed growing. There's been a very interesting article in Foreign Policy which talks about the need for the West to come up with a new approach to find an end to this war. But the hardliners remain in the ascendant, the neocons remain in control, the war goes on. Well, that's me for the day. This is where I finish. More from me tomorrow. More updates upon what's happening in Bakhmut and on the battlefronts. We'll see whether there's any more progress with the Ukrainian offensive. We'll see if the Russian Air Force takes a more active role. And I expect tomorrow I will be talking about some of the rather strange, at least to my mind, decisions on energy policy taken by the German government, the closing down of the nuclear power stations, and the political situation in Germany, which is becoming more fragile, also it seems to me, with signs that the coalition, the German coalition, is now in serious difficulties. But anyway, that's for tomorrow. This is me for the day. More from me soon. Just to remind you again, you can find all our videos on all our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also go to our shop, buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there, magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.